All right, Matt, looks like we've got some people filing in here.
Perfect. There's always the tell for whether the last one was any good. People come back.
And if we had visuals all around, we could see if anybody has a really large coffee or not,
It's true.
All right. I'm going to kick us off like I did last time. I'm going to put this in the chat here. Always like to see where people are dialing in from. So I'm going to put it in here. Scott Rothman, Challenger, Arlington, VA. Yeah, if anyone chiming in or joining here, would love to see where you're calling in from. It's in the chat. We know we've got some people dialing in from abroad. Matt's hanging out at the beach today. All right, Dallas, Scottsdale, warmer places than here in DC, I'll say that much. All right, Slovakia. I knew we had some folks coming in outside North America. All right. Couple of Kansas City.
We should start a debate on who has better barbecue between the Austin folks and the City folks. But we don't have all day, so
I was gonna say we don't have the time, I don't think. Hey Jack, thanks for dialing in.
No debate necessary. So Is
there anyone here from North Carolina? Anyone want to chime in?
all right, we probably shouldn't have said that.
Oh, that's too funny. I give folks another minute or so.
Yeah, Roberta's like me. I'll eat it all, and
Yeah.
I live in DC, so we're not even in consideration. So it's all good to me.
Roberta's going to want to talk pizza, I think, maybe some sort of deep dish, maybe. I'm of course making all sorts of generic assumptions here. Oh no, I was right. Yes, okay, I feel better now. All right, I've got three after. Maybe we'll give folks one more minute, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Jack wins the book club award for dialing into book club at 1 a.m. his time.
Yeah.
So if Jack has a tall cup of coffee to keep himself awake, that's no reflection on the quality of book club.
Oh, that's too funny. Okay, well, let's do this. Officially, good morning. A very early morning for Jack. Good afternoon, good evening to so many others. Thanks for joining us for the second session. For those of you that don't know, my name is Scott Rothman. I'm a market director here with Challenger's Effortless Experience. And with me is Matt Dixon, Chief Research and Innovation Officer at Tethr, and of course, author of the Effortless Experience, who, if you didn't catch, is enjoying the warmth at the beach. I'm not sure, is it warm up there? Kind
of chilly here, so it's not too warm. I'm much happier inside doing book club with all you. So
it's kind of soup day here in DC, but again, thank you for joining us. We're going to be covering chapter 2 today, why your customers don't want to talk to you. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this book club is going to be a little different than most. We've got a number of folks on the line, and so it's going to be a little difficult to ask a discussion question and then open up the lines and have a conversation. But we do want this to be interactive. We've got questions we'll ask you, but we also want you to be able to ask questions. So please submit all your questions via the chat. Like we did last time, we're going to do our best to incorporate answers into the conversation. Again, to be transparent, we might not get to them all in the session, but we're going to do our best to get them over the course of the book club, or we'll address them at the beginning of the next session. As I mentioned last time, that's sort of our incentive to keep you coming back. And I'll continue to mention this throughout our time together. If you like book club, if you enjoyed the last session, if you enjoy our time together today, please tell your friends, tell your colleagues. If you're active on social media, please do post about book club on LinkedIn, tag Matt, tag me. We'd appreciate any and all social media sharing. And then, as Matt and I emphasized last week, if you don't like book club, we are not Matt Dixon, we are not Scott Rothman. Feel free to tag someone.
Two other guys.
Yeah, anybody else really. In that vein, to start things off, Matt and I wanted to circle back to the questions that we might not have addressed last week, and one in particular that was posed, and there's some discussion that took place in the chat. So we'll get to that, and then we'll get into chapter 2. That question or discussion we want to circle back to came from Mark, and it was around, are you noticing the trend that wow is now expected and beyond wow is now being demanded? Matt, we've talked, I think, a lot about this off and on at various times, and I think we've had very similar experiences and whatnot, but I'll turn it over to you to kind of kick things off.
Yeah, it's a great question. Couple of thoughts here. One we're going to talk about today. I think, there are a couple, Scott and I were talking about this recently, but the book came out in 2013, and we've continued to do research at Tethr. Scott's team has continued to do research at Challenger around how the effort story continues to evolve and how it changes. And there's some pieces of the story that just by definition are fast moving and are going to change. The primary one we're talking about today, which is digital, use of technology, self-service, in this whole pillar around channel stickiness that we're going to talk about in a little bit. Now, I think you'll find as we get into it, the story hasn't changed a ton, but the what expectations are per the question that Scott just threw out there, I think has changed quite a bit. And I don't want to tip my mitt too much to my point of view on this one, but I think if we're honest with ourselves, the customer's expectations in 2013 when we wrote the book around digital and self-service are quite different from what they are today. What was wow stuff in 2013 is kind of table stakes today. And we're continuing to see some of those innovations, I think, on the self-service side that will raise the bar for everyone else. Now, the one thing I would say is I don't know that, there's this weird like dualism, I think, around customer expectations. I think on the one hand, we talk a lot about in customer service and in customer experience about how expectations continue to go up, right? And I think that's true. It's like a truism in customer experience research. And I think that is true. Certain companies raise the bar, then everyone else has got to kind of keep pace, or at least not let the gap open up too much. But at the same time, I think it's also true to say that the customer's expectations have never been lower, when it comes to interacting with companies. You hear our former colleague, Rick DeLisi, who's one of the co-authors on Effortless Experience, is fond of talking about this, is this weird tension between, yes, customer expectations are going up, but if we're honest with ourselves, I just called a provider of mine this morning, and I got to be honest, my expectations weren't terribly high. I wasn't expecting to be wowed. I was expecting to get the runaround and to be disappointed. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. So, so it is a weird tension. I think somebody made the comment in the chat last time, and I think it bears repeating, which is that as individual brands, I think we've got to be really careful about resetting the bar with our customers. Yes, the bar naturally gravitates upward in certain areas, especially around technology. But when you think about things like exceptions and givebacks and things we do for our customers or freebies we give to them in the hopes of wowing them, we've got to be careful that that customer is now anchored on a different experience. So when they call in next time and they ask for, simple example, you gave me a pass on my late fee, or you waived the late fee. But if I have another one and I call back and I want that rep to take pity on me as well, I just forgot that my bill was due and I missed it by a couple of days, and can you waive that $25 or $35 fee? And that representative says no. The customer suddenly is, while that may be the policy and it may be the kind of meets expectations experience, they're now quite underwhelmed because they were, if you will, wowed or delighted in the past. So as individual brands, I think we've always got to be cognizant of that. But again, we'll talk a little bit in this pillar around chapter 2, channel stickiness, and why your customers don't want to talk to you, and technology and all that good stuff. That I think has changed. And I think what was a wow experience in 2013 is kind of sort of expectations, meets expectations, digital experience today. Scott, what do you think about that one?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's spot on. I think the thing that's always stuck out for me when we talk about stickiness and so on is the expectations piece. And I think we've all had these experiences before. And the joke was back in the day when we published this was, hey, look, you want to be consistent and you don't want to be consistently great, right? We talked about that last time. But by the way, you don't want to be consistently bad either. It's kind of the Goldilocks situation where you want to be just right. And again, I think we all have these experiences. We oftentimes talk about, you go to the hotel or that you've always stayed at and so on and so forth, and you expect certain things. A few years back, My wife had some friends in town. We went to a restaurant that she and I love, and we've been there multiple times, and it's always exceptional. And this time it was just good. And our expectations were it was going to be exceptional. And we were a little bummed out. But her friends who had never been before couldn't believe what we were talking about. This is fantastic. And we said, no, you should have been here, a couple times ago. And it just goes to show it how so much of this is in the eye of the beholder and the experiences that we've had previous to that experience. And that's the I think the thing that sticks with me is that today's delight becomes tomorrow's standard, and that bar constantly raises if we are aiming for that delight every single time. It gets us into trouble. So for me it continuously goes back to expectations.
Yeah, Mark raised the a great point of it seems as though customers are looking for what went wrong instead of what went right, which reminds me a lot of how my parents read my report card when I was a kid. Terrific point, Mark. And you're right, Scott. I think we bring that. We talk about baggage and the baggage the customer brings to the experience. And part, a lot of that is just the past experiences inform their expectations of this experience that I'm in right now. And so your example of the restaurant's great, but let's go from old school service in a restaurant to modern service, using apps and websites and all that fancy technology. So maybe let's kick it off and talk a little bit about chapter 2, just in the interest of time. We've got a few slides just like we did last time. I'll go through these, pull Scott in, get his perspective, and what I'd encourage everyone to do is get in there with your comments and your questions. We'll do our best to weave those in during the discussion, and the ones that we don't get to, we'll try to pull, just like we did in the beginning of this session, try to pull some of those into the beginning of next week's session. We talked about one of the things, we came last week, we talked all about the data and the story, about how delight doesn't pay when things go wrong. And instead of trying to delight the customer in the hopes of making them more loyal, the better strategy is to mitigate their disloyalty by making service lower effort, by making it easier. And we talked about some of the things that drive that effort. And then we talked as well about the payoff. So from a top line perspective, it leads to a much higher propensity to repurchase, to spend more, and to say good things. I would say good things, but at least not say bad things about the brand. But also on the bottom line, it's good too, because it's a lot cheaper for us to deliver if we can get it right. And actually, I would tell you one of those big areas, and you all know this, for generating greater productivity, reducing cost, is migrating issues to digital and self-service. And as you're going to find here, and hopefully you came away with this takeaway from the chapter around technology, is that low effort companies think differently about technology, think differently about the digital experience. Now, I personally found, when we did the research, the data to be very compelling, but I actually thought the more interesting part of the story was, in the research, we were able to identify those companies who, in the eyes of customers, get it right, and then we spent a lot of time with those companies trying to distill their practices, the way they do things. And we came up with these 4 pillars of low effort service, which corresponds to the architecture of the book, more or less. But the first one about digital, that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the difference between first contact resolution and next issue avoidance, but thinking one step ahead. We're going to do that in the following session. Then in 2 sessions from now, we'll talk about skills and engineering the experience, an area that Scott and the team at Challenger have a ton of experience working with frontline reps and with supervisors and development folks, L&D folks, to drive some of these skills in the front line. And then lastly, we'll talk about frontline control and the idea of how the select 4 skills, the way we manage have changed, and how we manage our frontline folks have changed. One thing I'll draw your attention to is the really, really, really small print in the lower left of the slide, which is the copyright date. This is one of those funny things, as I said before, I think some of these lessons from Effortless Experience are evergreen. I think that's particularly true around next issue avoidance and experience engineering, and to some degree, frontline control. I think some of the lessons we'll talk about today around technology also evergreen at a high level, but I think this one has changed. I think the customer's expectations have changed. And so this is one I'll be leaning on the other participants of book club here, Scott, everyone, to jump in and talk a little bit about how they've seen the customer's technology preferences and expectations change. But without further ado, let's get into it. I always, when I present, this is not in the book, but one of my favorite things to do is to do a little bit of a show of hands. I'll tell you how this goes, since we're not we're not physically together for this. If we were enjoying canapé and a glass of wine over book club, we could do it live, but we're not. So imagine this. I'm in a room full of people, ballroom full of people, and I'm presenting the effortless experience research. And I always show these two screens and our shots here. And I say, okay, how many of you traveled to this event? And almost everybody's hand goes up. And then I say, how many people use what you see on the left-hand side or something like it? You use self-service to check in for your flight, answer the security questions, print out your boarding pass, select your seat, so on and so forth. Or did you use the option you see on the right, which I jokingly say, you know, that person you see there is called a ticketing agent. That is a human being at an airport who can help you with a, you know, by printing out a paper boarding pass, which Scott still uses as the bookmark for his personal copy of Effortless Experience. Now, there you go. So I do the show of hands, and it won't surprise anybody, I think, here in the group, that everybody's hands go up about the self-service option. And there are a couple of hands that go up about the live service. And I used to play this game where I would challenge folks in the audience to shout out, you know, who has the best excuse for why they went up to a human being to check in for their flight and get their boarding pass. And I've heard lots of good ones. You know, I had a surfboard, I was going surfing in Fiji. I had, you know, a twisted ankle and I wanted to beg to get upgraded to business class, whatever it was. The best story I've ever heard, and I will challenge everyone in book club, if you have a better story, throw it out there, for why you went to talk to a human being instead of using any number of self-service options you could have used to check in for your flight. If you come up with a better story, let me know, and you'll be immortalized from this point forward. But the best story I ever heard was a gentleman who said, raised his hand and said, yeah, I was walking to the kiosk to check in for my flight, and I looked over at the desk and I noticed that the woman behind the counter was the girl I went to prom with back in high school. And I was interested in what was going on. You know, she got married, did she have kids? And we hadn't talked to each other in 20 years. So I waited in line to say hello. And so I thought, so that's a pretty good excuse for going to the live service line. It's not a great business case for live service, but anyway, so you got a better story, throw it in the chat. But you know, it's so funny because you know, what we found is, while, you know, service practitioners, and this is oftentimes, these are audiences of people who really don't oversee the technology side of self-service. They don't own the website, they don't own the app, they're really managing the call center, the human beings taking calls, and even they would say, no, it's all about self-service today. But what's interesting is, as when we went out and wrote the book, and I think this one probably has changed, we went out to senior leaders and we asked them, you know, to what extent do you think your customers would rather self-serve? So you see that as web preference versus get live service, phone preference. And at the time we wrote the book, the preference was about 2.5x to 1, a 2.5x preference for live human being based interactions versus web self-service. And it was funny because the contrast we talked about in the research was this, is when we went out and we did something called the conjoint analysis, which if anybody wants to know about, I'd be glad to bore you with the details of how that works and what it is. But it's kind of a marketing methodology, and it forces people to trade off different experiences or different packages in this case. And so we asked customers to select, would you like service experience A or B, A or B, A or B, and went back and forth many, many times. And we were able to figure out from that is that whether it was live or digital self-service had no bearing on whether the customer picked one option or one experience or another. They were statistically indifferent, in other words. Now, I'll tell you, I think that what you see on the left-hand side probably was true when we wrote the book. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find management teams and boards of directors today who don't understand that customers want to engage with us and with our brands digitally. I still, though, think, and I find that when I talk to practitioners, I still hear people talking about, yeah, you know, but our CEO or our CFO or our COO, you know, they really think we got to make it easy for our customers to talk to our people, that it's really about that human connection. And so you still do hear a little bit of that out there, but what you see on the left-hand side, I think if we reran that survey today, we probably wouldn't find that. Nevertheless, it is interesting to point out, if you look at that graphic on the right-hand side, and we talk about how customers are really statistically indifferent, I'm always quick to point out, you know, sometimes people say, well, that probably is true for easy issues with those crazy millennials, or I guess we're talking about the Gen Zers or something now. And sure, that's true for those young people and for those simple issues. But what was interesting is that this data held irrespective of issue urgency or age decile. And so back when we ran the analysis, we found that even for urgent issues, customers are actually pretty open to using self-service options, provided they were easily navigable, findable, navigable, usable, et cetera. They would still be inclined to try self-service. Now, obviously, in really, really urgent situations, like my wallet was stolen and I'm worried about fraud, in some of those situations, there's a fire in my home, I need to call my insurance company stat. In those situations, yeah, you do see a preference for live service, but it doesn't look like what you see on the left-hand side. The other thing I'd point out is, again, this holds across age decile. So we found that at the time, the statistical breakpoint for where customers go from preferring self-service to preferring live service was 51 years of age. I actually believe that if we reran the analysis today, it would be even higher than that. I think it'd be probably closer to 60, 65 years of age, right? We know that technology is something that is being adopted and used in all aspects of life across age deciles. And so some of these data would be different if we reran the analysis today, but I think the theme is still relevant, that there is this belief still out there that our customers want to talk to us. But when we go out and we test it with data, we find our customers really don't. In fact, and then Scott, I'm going to go to you here in a moment to get your thoughts. But there are a couple of interesting takeaways, and this one I do have updated data on. It's as evidence that our customers are actually preferring today to go to self-service. One of the really head-snapping findings in the book was that the majority of inbound call volume is from customers who are first on our websites trying to self-serve on their issue. Now, if we're honest and we break that out, some of those customers were merely looking for a phone number. So you know that you've now spent tens of millions of dollars on a high-end phone book. But for most customers, they legitimately were on the website trying to find the answer. They're trying to execute some transaction. They're trying to do something. And they got turned around. They got confused. They didn't find what they were looking for. And then they picked up the phone to call. Now, remember, we talked about channel switching last week as a big driver of effort. And so what we're saying here is that the customer is in a state of high effort, not only because they're having the issue, but also because they've now had to switch out of the channel of choice to the live channel. So they're in a state of high effort before the representative even says hello. So talk about being in a corner, and for your people to have to really play defense. That's what's going on. The double whammy we found here was that more than a third of customers were actually on the phone and on the website or the app at the same exact time. So, and if you ever sidejack into a call or go back and listen to your call recordings for quality purposes or just to check in and listen to different calls, you hear customers saying this all the time. I was on hold waiting to talk to you, and man, boy, I got really sick of hearing that message saying, did you know you can do X, Y, and Z on www.acme.com? And I'll tell you what, I would spend an hour on www.acme.com, and you tell me how to get that done, because I kept getting that message or I couldn't find it or whatever, right? It's very, very frustrating to our customers. These data points, I think, especially the one on the left, we know for a fact has changed. In fact, it's gotten even worse. We wrote an article in HBR. We'll talk about this around frontline control called Kick-Ass Customer Service that came out after the book. It was a study of service rep profiles and personalities. And we found that when we wrote that study, we refreshed this data, and we found that the number was 80% today, that 80% of customers are going to digital before they go to live service. Now, just to give you a sneak preview of what we'll talk about in a few weeks, I mentioned before, some of the things in the book have changed since we wrote it. I think digital, by definition, is going to change. What a customer expects today versus what they expected in 2013. The implication of that is not just that we've got to get digital right, which we're going to talk about today, but there's another implication, which is for our frontline teams. If we think about our frontline agents, our representatives, our support staff working the frontline, engaged with customers, think about their job today as opposed to 15, 20, 30 years ago. Gone are the days that the easy issues are still coming into the call center. Like, people don't call the call center anymore to check their balance. They don't call to check on whether their flight's on time. They don't call to check into their flight or see where their package is. We can do all those things ourselves. So what's happening is that self-service is siphoning off certainly the easy issues. And as self-service becomes more and more sophisticated, even some of the more complex issues are going the way of self-service. So what that means for our frontline people is that what gets through the nets, what ends up in their queue are by definition the issues that customers couldn't solve on their own, right? The harder issues, the more complex and nuanced issues, the ones where they really got to talk to somebody to fully explain what's going on. Now, again, we'll talk more about that because I think that's really increased the importance of getting that frontline control piece right, hiring the right people, developing them the right way, putting them in a great climate or environment so they can really perform at their highest level. But let's talk about some of these data here, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what low effort companies do. So, Scott, what are your thoughts on this? What do you see as new or different around this? Thematically, you think we're still in the right zip code in terms of the takeaways?
I certainly think so thematically. I think, my mind goes to a couple different places. One is, just as a funny anecdote, here at Challenger, we have a lot of entry-level folks joining the organization, right? Straight out of school, straight out of college. And I was talking with one of them the other day and I was explaining Effortless. And I said, how you check your balance, your bank, your checking account balance on your phone. I said, well, back, and I had to think about it for a second. I said, go talk to your parents because they will remember a time where you had to pick up the phone and call the bank and ask about, their balance. I said, that just doesn't exist today, right? So to me, that's always an interesting example of how far we've come in the last 20, 25 years. But where my mind goes is the last 18 months or so. And I'd certainly love your perspective on this as well, because if I think about my conversations and I think about some research that CCW did a few months ago, what CCW found was that across the board, significant increases across every channel. Phone, chat, social media. And I do think we're heading in the right, again, thematically correct. But what's interesting to me is when I think about the conversations I've had during the pandemic and, whether we're talking to, let's say, a utility or we are talking to a bank or an insurer, a lot of the frontline reps were running into this situation where they were having incredibly sensitive conversations. Right, they're already having complex conversations. Now they're having complex and sensitive conversations, and so it has changed the nature of the game again. Right, as we think about even when this research was published, and we saw this trend of, hey, we're fielding more increasingly complex conversations. Now it's increasingly complex and sensitive conversations, and it cuts across all those different channels for sure. Again, not just phone, but social media and chat. And I see Mark posting about, virtual doctor visits and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
100%. So many organizations have had to pivot over the last 18 months. And so we're seeing it, I think, more and more. The only other thing that popped to my mind, Matt, is, and I'm going to get this slightly wrong, I think, but as we were leaving CEB, we had published some research around where customers go. And I'd be curious to hear people's thoughts in the chat, where people go. Because if I think about my process, I grab my phone, I check the app first, I go to the website, then I go to Google. And if I can't find what I'm looking for, I'm going to, place my call. Now, if there's something urgent, I'm going to just pick up the phone and make that call, right? If money's missing or I've missed my flight or whatever, absolutely. But the traditional process for me is what I just described. But I think so many others aren't quite that, don't think of that same way. I mean, there are plenty that do, I'm sure. But I know of a lot of people go right to Google, or they go to their friends or family or so on and so forth. And I'd just be curious as to, the process that the folks on the line are following these days. Are we going to the website first? Are we going to the app? Are you going to Google? Are you going to YouTube? I mean, there's so many resources these days, the online community, whatever it may be.
Yeah, you hit on a bunch of themes there, Scott. I think one is, we'll talk about this a little bit as we get into some of the data here. But let me just say, first of all, Scott and I have spent a bunch of time talking about this, but if I think about what was wow in 2013 and what's kind of, you should be doing that in 2021. I think one of the things I remember working on that study you're talking about, Scott, before I left CB, and at the time we were talking about omni-channel as if it was this pie in the sky, like, really that doesn't seem like anything customers would ever expect of a company. The idea of, I could be on a website, I could get a chat pop up from an agent who sees that I'm struggling. I'm engaged with that agent, and then the agent throws up a link and says, click this button, and now we're talking to one another in a voice interaction, all, without me having to stop and start over again and call into the call center and then re-explain myself and all these things. That kind of seamless baton handoff, that ideal of omnichannel, that was kind of crazy town stuff back in 2013. And I think today, you're seeing this part of it. The success of I think you're seeing some companies out there in this space, companies like a Customer, like a Gladly, like a Glia, these kinds of companies that are pioneering the space and actually making it believable and doable for the average company to actually provide an omni-channel experience, not just a multi-channel experience, an omni-channel experience. And I think that is now changing the expectations that customers have. Why was I just on the phone, or just on an omni-channel experience with this company, and now I'm on your website and your chat agent's telling me that I'm going to have to call in, and I can't continue that conversation. I got to start over from scratch. I'm going to wait on hold too to boot. And so that contrast, I think, as customers see some companies getting it right and lots of companies still getting it wrong, begins to, if you will, out those companies who are underinvesting and getting it wrong. Danny made the comment about, preferring self-service, except for when you have a really bad, for instance, virtual agent or chatbot experience, but we also know there are companies that actually do a pretty good job at that. And so now we think, why is it that these folks get it right and those folks get it wrong? And it's often not within your industry. They're comparing us all to just all the other companies they do business with. So, sorry, go ahead, Scott.
No, I was just going to say, as you were talking about the omni-channel experience and whatnot, a few months ago, every year I have an issue with my cable company that starts with a C. Many of you may know it.
It's not Cable Co.
No, it is not. Actually, I'm not sure why I'm holding back. I mentioned Uber Eats last time. I'll mention it. It's Comcast, and I have an issue once a year with them, and inevitably it's a 2 or 3 hour issue. And I'll give them some credit. Their chat functionality is way better than it used to be. You can still tell they're handling 4 or 5 chats at once. But of course, we got disconnected. And so I called. And of course, there was absolutely no record of it. And it's an aspiration, and it's been an aspiration for so many companies that we've worked with over the years. And now it is coming to fruition where you can finally create that experience. And I think companies are getting better, but it's still a bit of a journey.
Yep. And so Scott, you also, one of the other comments you made, which I think is really important for us to think about and discuss, is the impact of COVID. So we wrote an article, some of you may have seen it in HBR, it was in the spring of last year. So it was right, a couple months in on the pandemic. And it was called Supporting Customer Service Through the Coronavirus Crisis. And that was the big theme or one of the big themes of the piece was, this is really the time where you've got to make sure you're getting digital right, because let's be honest, there's a couple of things happening. One is capacity to handle calls is down, right? So at the time we were still, hard to believe now, but there was a time where we're letting people go, right? And we're furloughing staff and laying people off, and now we can't hire fast enough. But there was a time where capacity was down. Many of our offshore partners had to close their locations, maybe because they couldn't actually work from home, right? And the call center was closed. So that capacity, overflow capacity, is gone too. And on top of that, you had a higher volume, especially in certain industries. Think about travel and leisure, think about medical insurance, financial services, utilities, people struggling to pay their bills, right? Things like that, experiencing financial hardship. So you had a higher volume of calls coming into a much smaller pipe. And as Scott said, those calls really loaded with quite a bit of emotion. It's very sensitive issues. And so, this really was forcing a lot of customers out into the self-service channel where, that customer, pre-pandemic would have been perfectly fine waiting on hold for a little bit to talk to a live representative. That may have been their preference. Now, when they dial in and they're told it might be an hour or two before they can get to an agent, and they're going to go to www.acme.com and give it a whirl and see if it works. And if it doesn't, watch out, because they're going to call back and give that representative an earful, and they might use the time in intervening time to get on Facebook or Twitter to badmouth the brand. And so there's a lot of this kind of, I think, is coming to a head with in the current environment. I think it's in some ways a good thing from teaching our customers to engage with us differently. I don't think it's the way we would have wanted to get there, right? But coming out of this, I think many brands I talk to are saying, we're finding a lot of our customers who were just diehard phone, or live service callers, now trying some of these other channels because they actually had a good experience. They found out it was actually easier, and they're more likely to go use it next time. And boy, it was so hard just getting them to try it. We tried every trick in the book and we just couldn't get them to try it. And now they are doing it. And that's been a good thing. But it's kind of like in self-service in some way, COVID sort of shot some of those preferences, those expectations and company capabilities through this tunnel of time. And we kind of got to a place a lot faster than maybe any of us thought, due to this. And it's the same thing for the work environment, right? And the place we're landing now in this hybrid, sometimes in the office, sometimes at home, kind of work world. Maybe we would have gotten there in 30 or 40 years, but COVID kind of pushed that through the tunnel of time in a very expedited way.
Well, I think this goes to a lot of what's written in chapter 2, and there are just a couple things that I'll mention, and then we can push forward. Of course, is at the highest level. I think on the first page of chapter 2, on page 37, you talk about, and I think we often forget this, though. When we don't get this right, it hurts the companies not just once but twice.
Yeah,
is the line, right? Increase operating costs as well as decrease customer loyalty. And then later on in the chapter, you spend some time talking about the paradox of choice. You talk about oh no, I'm completely blanking. It was the paradox of choice and one other thing. Shoot.
Don't worry, we're going to get to it.
We're going to get to it. It's very important, and I've just completely forgotten what my second point is. As soon as Matt starts talking, I'm going to think about it.
Actually, but let me, Scott, if I could, you reminded me of something I forgot to say about this slide on the right. Just a story. I don't know if this is I don't think this is actually in the book, but I remember presenting this to a company, their leadership team, and the CFO of the company, who had literally just a month before had approved a huge expenditure for upgrading the company's support portal and self-service website and all these, new chat functionality, all these kinds of things that the customer service organization had been pushing for a long time. And he just approved a large expenditure, a large investment there. And it wasn't actually having the call deflection that he had hoped for. At least they weren't seeing it yet. And so we're looking at this, and then I just finished telling him that channel switching is a big source of effort. And this is coming from the person who just approved millions of dollars to upgrade their self-service functionality, which is having no impact. And he said, so I just paid a whole bunch of money to make my customers more disloyal to us. I was like, that's a painful recognition, but yeah, I mean, it comes down to the fact that a lot of companies really do get service wrong. I think I'll spend a couple more minutes here. I want to talk a little bit about channel preference and engagement preference. And I think this is one of those things that hasn't really changed. And then we're going to talk also about my favorite kind of low tech fix, which is the language simplicity story from Travelocity that hopefully you enjoyed in that chapter. But one of the things that I think is important for companies to remember, oftentimes I think when they think about, well, why is self-service not working? Why are our customers not staying there? We know they're going there first, but they're bouncing out and they're ending up in the phone queue. It must be because we're not offering them the option that our competitors offer them. Maybe they have video chat and we don't have that. Maybe they have an expert community, we don't have that. Maybe they have social service, we don't offer that. And so we've got to put more and more functionality in front of the customer and let it be kind of a choose your own adventure. And I think in some respects, this is like a worldview that technology vendors who sell the capabilities that make this happen have foisted upon us or convinced us of, which is that the customer, you need to meet the customer where they are, that they let them pick their channel of choice, but you got to offer it. If one person Scott wants to use a payphone to get in touch with the call center and wait on hold for 3 hours, you got to do that. If I want to ride a hovercraft skateboard and have a virtual reality interaction with a call center, you got to do that, right? You got to offer all the choice to the customer. Now, I think what we found though in the data is when you use a similar kind of conjoint methodology, what you find is that most customers actually don't value choice over ease. What we found was the vast majority of customers actually value ease over choice. And let me just explain what I mean by that. What we're talking about is, if you were to go out to customers and say, here's a whole host of options you have for engaging with this company. You have phone, obviously. You can send them a letter if you like. You have a knowledge base. You have FAQs on a website. You have an expert community. You have a chat. You have social service. And each of those, some of them were easy, some of them were hard to use. What you found is that 16% of customers would actually place their channel preference over ease. And by the way, those 16% of customers almost entirely were customers who were in demographics, older demographics, where they really preferred the phone. And again, as we talked about before, we think that's changing quite a bit, but that's not a huge percentage of our customer base anyway. But these are kind of the phone diehards. They're not gonna use those apps and websites. They're gonna still pick up the phone and call. Now, the vast majority of customers, though, you see on the right-hand side here, valued ease over choice. So these are customers. It doesn't mean they don't have service preferences, and this is something we need to be really careful of as companies. If we went out and asked those customers, hey, how do you want to get your problem solved with our company? They'll tell you. You know, some of them will say, like Scott will say, I like to engage with other technical users in an expert community. I would say I'd like to use chat because I like that I can multitask. And I actually like the fact that it takes a little bit of time for the agent to get back to me because it means I don't have to be all plugged in like I am in a phone call. And so people will express their preference. But then if you tell them that one channel is easier to use than the other for solving a specific issue, their preference goes out the window. And what they will do is go with what you recommend. Now, the exercise we talk about in the book is the issue to channel mapping exercise, which is an important one. What that is really simply is if we think, every company on the call today, we all have these common issues that we get in the call center. And then we have a whole host of channels that we engage our customers through. What we should do, what each of us should do, is think about those issues, map, and then grade each of our channels for how good it is at solving each of those issues. And what you're going to find is that it's a bit spotty. You're going to find some channels that are pretty bad across the board. A good one is email. Email tends to underdeliver almost entirely. It's very good for, open-ended compliments or complaints for which the customer expects no timely response. Other channels are really good at other issues. But here's the thing is that we often keep that to ourselves. Like we might know for a fact that chat is not a great way to solve an issue that requires us to access the customer's account because of the security and privacy rules in our institution or in our industry. We're going to have to tell that customer to pick up the phone and call. So why don't we tell the customer that, right? Why don't we have almost a sorting hat mechanism up front that tells the customer, if this is your issue, you should go here. If this is your issue, you should go there. And that was the case for MasterCard merchant services that you'll remember. They do a really nice job there. But the point here is to think about how do we provide more guidance and less choice. Our customers don't deal with these issues all the time. We do. And so if we know one channel is really good at solving that issue, but boy, one of them is really a terrible option, and we're crossing our fingers that the customer doesn't pick it, why don't we have big warning signs telling the customer, hey, do not go here because you are going to get turned around, you're going to get confused, you're going to get lost, you're going to get frustrated. Go here instead. And so again, the idea of providing more guidance. And then I'll give you my low-tech tactic here in a moment. But Scott, any thoughts here on the guidance versus choice kind of paradox?
It resonates so much with me, and I think it resonates with so many people I speak with. And I actually remember when I first was exposed to these findings. No kidding, I was sick, and I remember leaving work, and I went to the grocery store to go get some chicken soup or chicken noodle soup, whatever it is. And you go to the grocery store, and I don't know if anyone has done this recently, but has anyone been to the grocery store and looked at the soup aisle? I mean, there's about 50 different selections you can make around chicken noodle soup. And I went, got in my car, went to Panera and got some chicken noodle soup. And by the way, the chicken noodle soup at Panera is not half bad, but I haven't bought a can of chicken noodle soup and I don't know how long. The options, it was almost too much in that moment. And when I could just go to Panera and know that there's one option, I'm going to buy it and we're going to do it.
What Scott's talking about here is
absolutely. And so I'm getting ahead of myself, but the other thing, when I talk to organizations and we talk about this attempt to be all things to all people, right? By launching all these channels, I often ask the question, just out of curiosity, have you ever shut down a channel? Mm-hmm. Right. So as we've added, have you ever removed one? And more often than not, you get a pause and you go, I think we still actually have our fax up. People can still fax us. And you sit there and go, wait, what? You can, and it just, I think it goes to your point of, we are trying to be all things to all people. We're getting better there, but it is really a challenge to not launch more, to not try, right? I mean, I think we all think that way of, hey, we got to meet them where they are, when in reality, to your point and to the researcher's point, it's about guiding them to the easiest channel. And the last story that resonates with me is a handful of years ago. Now, admittedly, this was a handful of years ago, and so some preferences have changed, but I think this is a case in point. Insurance firm that we've worked with for a number of years back in the CB days. Many of you will know it. I was talking to an operations leader there, and his son had just started college. And they were talking about how they had gone to the local bank to open an account. And a couple months later, the son calls, his father, say, look, I'm having challenges. Calls the 800 number, can't get what he's looking for. No kidding, this 18-year-old kid walked into the branch and found Jane, who could help him. And now that's where he went whenever he had a problem. Either went into the branch or he called Jane. And it, I think, just proves the point in the research to say, look, we can try to be all things to all people, but when we can guide people to a low effort channel, that's likely the option they're going to choose.
Yeah, just as a father of two college age boys, I would tell you that that person he went to also didn't give him money, which is when my kids have problems, the bank account works fine. The fact that there's a zero balance is the issue. Scott, this is what Scott was talking about. Whenever I present this work around choice versus guidance, talk about this work by Barry Schwartz. There's a great TED Talk if you haven't listened to it. And if you want to learn more, his book is fantastic, called The Paradox of Choice. And it's all about, how choice, while, in our society, I think, and we think about in modern society, we've been sort of led to believe that more choice is better. So, Scott's point about buying a can of soup is the same, as if you're buying a car, you're buying, try to choose like a mobile plan, a health insurance plan. The Barry Schwartz tells a story in the beginning of the book about going to buy a pair of jeans. And he said, gone are the old days where you buy a pair of jeans. Now it's, 10 different colors and washes and fits and cuts and button fly and zip fly and all these things. And, what ends up happening is it leads to purchase regret. And it leads to dysfunctional behavior, which is often not making a choice. It leads to decision avoidance, procrastination, and it leads to quite a bit of purchase regret. So you find that, and he said this, he said, when I went in and I bought a pair of jeans, I was less happy with the decision, even though I had more options. And the whole book explores why that is. And I think for us as companies, one of the things we have to think about is, when our customers have issues and they reach out to us for help, we might think, because we've been led to believe the customer's always right, meet them where they are, give them all the bells and whistles, the all singing, all dancing experience, every option imaginable. But what the customer really wants more than anything else is an easy experience. And what they really, really want is to get back to what they're doing before. They don't really want to have this issue, and they don't want to have to solve it on your website, your app, or with a live person. They just would prefer not to have that. And so if we can guide them to the easiest experience that makes it as effortless as possible, based on our knowledge of what works and what doesn't, then we should tell people that. One of the things that Schwartz and others have talked about is the idea of option or selection choice defaults. And there's quite a bit of research around this in the field of decision science. But think about, for instance, when we offer food to our kids in the school cafeteria, there are reasons that the healthy food is placed is the easiest to reach, and that the least healthy food, it takes a little bit more work. You got to reach down, you got to reach over to get it. And so what they try to do is give people choice, but make the default the right choice, right? And it can sound a little bit kind of paternalistic here, but what I'd say for companies is to think about, if there is a default choice that you want to give the appearance of having lots of options, but you want to make it really easy to pick the one that is going to be best, then think about, some of that comes down to positioning and things like that. Is, we recommend this one in the same way like Amazon recommends certain products and certain for certain use cases or certain categories. Let me talk about the low tech solution here. This is one of my favorite stories from the book. I think digital can feel overwhelming to people because of what Scott said before. We spend a lot of money on this stuff, and after we find out it doesn't really work, nobody wants to raise their hand and say, yeah, that was my call to invest $1 million in this thing. So my bad, let's shut it down. Like that never happened in the history of like the corporate world. And so these things tend to perpetuate, right? It's just like, and we all become like channel hoarders, right? We keep glomming on more, but we just won't get rid of anything. And, but this one I think is a low tech practice that I think people really like because it doesn't require a lot of money. It's not about channel architecture. It's not about biting the bullet and shutting things that don't work down, which is hard to do if we're honest with ourselves. And it's about this, it comes down to this Twain quote. You might remember this. I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one instead. And what I find when we studied this with is, and this is great, this is a hallmark of what low effort companies do. It's not that they spend more money on technology and self-service, but the way they think about the self-service experience is far more streamlined. It's much more intuitive. And what they've realized is that one of the places where self-service experiences go to die is often in our FAQs or our knowledge articles. We put out there an answer to a commonly asked question, and it made sense when we wrote it, but then the people in marketing and in compliance and legal, they all got their hands on it, and suddenly it doesn't make sense anymore. You have to work in the business or work in the industry to really understand what that answer or that knowledge article means. And so we introduced this idea of, and this was borrowed from Travelocity, who first did this, was using an algorithm to score the complexity of language. Now, there are several of these out there, but the one that Travelocity used was called the Gunning-Fogg Index Score, invented by Robert Gunning, who you see here, who's a Princeton professor in the 1950s. And Gunning had developed an algorithm that effectively scored using a combination of sentence length, vocabulary, syntax, punctuation, could basically say, here is the level of education you need to have to understand a passage of text. I love this example to show you how it works. This is, Scott and I both live in the DC area, and so we can both agree, I think, that if you're looking for confusing things that are said publicly, go to Capitol Hill because there's a lot of it. Tim Geithner, you all remember, former Treasury Secretary for Obama, said this at the height of the financial crisis before the Senate Finance Committee. The US government should create one agency with responsibility for systemic stability over major institutions and critical payments and settlement systems and activities, which Scott might understand because he spent a long time in the financial services practice at CEB. I didn't spend long enough there to really understand this stuff. So I'll tell you, that has a Gunning score if we run it through the algorithm of 24.6, which is basically equates to like a PhD and a half that you need to have to understand what's being said. Now, what Geithner could have said, using far fewer words in much simpler language, is the following: set up an agency that makes sure banks remain stable and follow the law. That has a Gunning score of 8.5, which means my daughter, who is in 7th grade, easily understands that, and her younger friends in 6th and 5th grade understand it too. Now, this is a must-go do for everybody here. Take your FAQs, take your knowledge articles, heck, take content from your billing statement, take content from your marketing collateral, and running through the Gunning-Fogg Index score. It's freeware. It's available online. You see the URL there at the bottom of the slide. Just start dropping the stuff in there, hit calculate, and you will be horrified by the scores that come back. And again, this might be stuff that makes sense to all of you because you work in the company or you work in the industry, but it doesn't make sense to your customers. And so what Travelocity did, and I think is completely brilliant, is they hired a writing team. These were all English and communications majors straight out of university. Turns out a lot cheaper than a website. They hired these folks and had them rewrite everything in their FAQs and their knowledge articles. And what they found was customers suddenly stopped calling with the issues that forever would perplex them. Like, why do our customers keep calling us, asking us about carry-on baggage allowance? Or luggage allowance or whatever. And it turns out they were just using some industry terminology that was throwing people off. And so people saw it, they read it, but there was something that wasn't quite right. They didn't feel like they fully grasped. And so then they pick up the phone to get clarity. And it just baffled Travelocity for years and years and years why people keep calling about this stuff. It's the number one FAQ. Like, what do I do if my flight's canceled? How do I pick my seat? How do I check in? How big of a bag can I bring on board? They can never understand it. And they use an algorithm, the Gunning-Fogg score in this case, had their team of English majors write everything to a 5th grade reading level. And when they did that, they found that people consumed the content, they absorbed it, they understood it, and then they stopped calling about these issues. And I'll be very careful here. This is not to suggest your customers are not smart people. We have lots of smart customers. But this is to suggest, and I mean this, is that they are all attention deprived. They're not going to break out a thesaurus or some sort of technical try to understand a technical explanation or a piece of industry jargon. They're just going to bounce out and pick up the phone and call. And so if we want to get our customers to stay, want to create that sticky self-service experience, we need to make things simple. And language is one of the best places to do it. Anyway, with that, I see I'm getting the virtual stage hook from Scott. So a couple of parting thoughts here. Again, we're talking about self-service. This is one that's really changed. I threw it out before. I think omni-channel is one of those capabilities that was pie in the sky in 2013 is much more expected today by customers. I think the push to call, save your place in line, get a call back, or even like I did with my mobile carrier today, got on the app, skipped the queue and just said, call me when you're ready. And 2 minutes later, they called me. That kind of stuff is much more expected today, where back in 2013, it just was not. And so we've got to be aware that that part of the customer experience, the service experience, is evolving and preferences are changing right before our eyes. So with that, I will tell you again, one of the big implications here is that it's the hard stuff that ends up getting through the nets and gets to our people. And so that really does mean that we've got to be much more thoughtful about all the other stuff we're going to talk about, equipping our folks with the right skills to handle those issues with customers who are deeply frustrated because they just spent time on YouTube or Google, like Scott talked about before. Then they went to our website and now they've invested hours trying to avoid picking up the phone to call. And now they've had to pick up the phone to call and they are in a bad spot. And so how does our representative reduce the level of effort when in fact it was a high effort experience? There's not a lot we can do about making it less effort, but what are the things our reps can do in that moment to engineer the experience? How do we make sure we're hiring the right people, we're managing them and rewarding them in the right way? So we'll talk all about that in the remaining sessions. And Scott, I'm going to give you the last word here before we let people get on with their day.
I think just two final comments. I mean, in what you were just saying, it reminds me of one, I think the earliest insights that we came across, which was, when you're talking about some of the technology, again, we're no longer being compared to folks that are just in our industry, right? We're getting compared to every other experience that we're having. And I do vaguely remember the first time, hey, rather than wait on hold for 30 minutes, give us your number and call back, and you go, why can't everybody have that? Right? I mean, that is, I think, a perfect example of that. The other couple things that I'll mention is in the book, my favorite low tech practice is on page 50. It's the fidelity case, fidelity practice. So if you aren't familiar with that one, I'd highly suggest checking that out as well. In the chat, I put page 61 or 62 is where Matt talks about the fog index. And then the last thing I'll mention is also on page 61, what Matt talks about is, think about which channel is the worst for your most common issues, right? And then ensure customers don't choose that option, because you were mentioning that a lot of times people struggle with how to choose what the best channel is. Take it from the opposite angle and choose what the worst is. I know we've got just a minute left. Want to thank everyone for joining us. We'll be here same time, same channel next week. If you have any questions for us, again, please email us, link into us, and of course, as always, any sharing on LinkedIn is greatly appreciated. Thank you to everyone for today, and we will talk soon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.